Say hello. My name is Bridget Fisher. I'm the Associate Director of the Schwartz Center for Economics, home to the Retirement Equity Lab, or ReLab. ReLab is directed by economist and retirement expert Teresa Ghilarducci, who is here with us in a square today. ReLab is dedicated to producing academic research to help solve the retirement crisis. We're here to share with you research from our quarterly report on older workers put together by our team of economists, who I'll introduce in a second. While we've been issuing this report for a few years now, currently we're dedicated to looking at how the pandemic is having unique effects on older workers, which is what we'll talk about today. So to start with some introductions, then we'll move into the presentation. I've already introduced Teresa, but I also want to introduce Siavash Radpour, who's our Associate Director of the ReLab on the research side, and Owen Davis, who will be giving our presentation today. And all three are co-authors of today's report. And then the rest of our team here is Michelle, the Assistant Director, and our other economists, Mike, Barbara, and Ida. So with that, Owen, do you want to take it away and give us a 10 to 12 minute explanation of our data results?
Can do. Let me just share there. Are we good?
Yeah, looks good.
Great. So hi, everyone, and thanks, Bridget. This presentation is going to focus on our top line finding in this quarterly report, which is that the stalled jobs recovery pushed more than 1 million older workers out of the labor force in recent months. I think anyone who follows the labor market knows that as the pandemic resurged in late 2020, and even slightly before then, the recovery stalled overall. But what is less appreciated is that in certain respects, the recovery slipped backwards for older workers. The most important way it slipped backwards for older workers is in the labor force participation. Older workers' labor force participation rate has dropped continuously since August and is now at its lowest point since the recession began. And during that time, 1.1 million older workers exited the labor force. At the same time, we find no jobs have been added for older workers in that time period. So older workers' unemployment rate did fall in January, but that decline was driven entirely by older unemployed workers leaving the labor force rather than unemployed workers finding jobs. And finally, we found that since October, some of the racial gaps in employment that opened up at the beginning of the recession and had started to close during the recovery are now opening up again. So I'm going to focus mainly on that top line finding about labor force participation, because that's where we see that the older worker recovery was completely erased by the labor market stalling in recent months. So this chart shows labor force participation rates for older workers and mid-career workers, and they are given kind of benchmarked to pre-pandemic levels. So we can compare these two groups. As a refresher, the labor force participation rate is the share of workers that are the share of the population that is either has a job or is looking for a job. So anytime an unemployed worker decides to stop looking for work because they're discouraged and they leave the labor force, that leads to a decline in the labor force participation rate. So the broad trends between and then we're going to compare mid-career workers to our older workers. Our older workers we define as those 55 and older, and our comparison group for older workers is mid-career workers aged 35 to 54. So in this chart, you can see the broad trends between the two groups are similar. Though there are two important differences. One is that older workers have seen more severe impacts on their labor force participation than mid-career workers. And then in the second half of 2020, we see that for mid-career workers, there was some stagnation in the recovery, but older workers really declined precipitously during that time. So this is really an older worker story that we're looking at. I'm going to zoom in on some particular times during the pandemic to put some numbers to the series here. So first, when the pandemic shock first hit, we see that older workers, again, that orange line, their participation was hit much harder than the mid-career workers. and the fall in the labor force participation for older workers reflects 1.8 million of those older workers leaving the labor force between February and May. Then there was this recovery period in the summer of 2020 that saw 1 million older workers return to the labor force. So not a complete recovery, but there was, the first steps to recovery. An optimistic person might think that if this continued, we could have been fully recovered by now or at some time this year if that trend would have continued. But instead, as we know, the later part of 2020 saw 1.1 million older workers leave the labor force. That labor force participation dropped from August to January, which is our most recent data, and is now at its lowest point since the pandemic began, even lower than April and May. And once again, just to compare with that mid-career group, the green line, there was definitely a stalling of the recovery between August and January. They didn't improve their labor force participation rate, but neither did it fall nearly as steeply as for older workers. So in sum, since before the pandemic began until now, there's been 1.9 million labor force exits among older workers. That's due to the pandemic recession. If we, to put in more scale, if we add in the 1.1 million unemployed because of the pandemic recession, we get a total of 3 million older workers who don't have jobs now because of the pandemic recession, who we could assume would have had jobs otherwise. So there's a deficit, a jobs deficit for older workers of about 3 million. And for context, there were 38 million or 37 million employed older workers before the pandemic began. So our report has a number of other glimpses into the way that employment and unemployment have progressed throughout the recession, and now into December or into January 2021. One more of these points that I want to bring up before we close is looking at that decline in employment and how it's distributed across racial groups for older workers. In every recession, job declines are more severe for non-white workers, and that's something that we have seen in this recession. And what this chart shows is essentially the employment losses by racial group. That top line, the red one, is white workers, and we also have Black, Hispanic, and Asian. Those lines all move somewhat differently because of geographic factors, but the basic story is the same, is that these racial gaps opened up in the first months of the recession. And if we just focus on one of those lines, the Black-white unemployment gap, so this orange line is Black workers, the red line is white workers, we can see that in the initial months of the recession, May, June especially, that gap opened up between white and Black workers, that Black workers had steeper employment declines. They lost more jobs in those months as white workers were starting to recover. And then in mid-summer, we start to see some of that closing between the gap, that Black-white gap, and Black workers starting to regain some of the ground that they had lost relative to white workers and starting to regain jobs. But as the recovery stalls and then steps backwards for all older workers, it really falls backwards faster for Black workers. It falls faster for all non-white workers. So that if we just look from October until for this data, the most recent is December. If we just look during that time, the decline in employment has been twice that for non-white workers as it was for white workers. So we know that older workers who are unemployed or out of the labor market already face disadvantages to returning to employment due to age discrimination, and non-white older workers not only face that, but the double disadvantage of racial discrimination and structural barriers. So looking forward, we expect that this stalled recovery is going to exacerbate the retirement gaps that we focus on here at SCEPA. We expect that as the pandemic starts to be brought under control by vaccination and other measures, the recovery will resume. People will return to the labor force, return to work, but at this point, older workers have a deeper hole to dig out of than they did 3 to 5 months ago in, say, the summer of 2020 or early fall. And that's especially true with returning from out of the labor force. We know from prior research and our own work as well that labor force exit among older workers increases the risk of early and involuntary retirement, and that longer spells of joblessness, which we're seeing now that the jobs recovery has stalled or stepped backwards for older workers, these longer spells of being without a job increase the risk of drawing down on IRAs, on 401ks, and in general, sacrificing some well-being in retirement due to challenges that workers are facing now. And then these two risks of early involuntary retirement and retirement asset drawdowns, like many things, are unequally distributed, and the employment declines that we see and the racial gaps that we see are going to translate into larger retirement wealth gaps, especially by race. So that is it for this part of the presentation. My team and I are here to answer any questions. If you have any particular data questions or anything like that, I can either see if I have the data here or we can respond individually.
Teresa, I just wanted to offer, did you have any last comments to share, or?
I'm sorry that this news was bad news, but it's breaking news, and it's based on numbers that are precise and calculated. So I feel this is the freshest view of something quite startling. I think, Owen, your pictures just told the whole story of that hope we had in the summer really fading for older workers. And it's really the end of the line for these workers. If they don't get back into the labor force, we really have a big retirement crisis on our hands. So it just accelerated what we had already known. So, and thank you. That's what I meant to say. Thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you. If anybody has any questions, I put my email in the chat, so please follow up. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.